Every account of a medieval royal feast reads like an indictment. 4,000 woodcock. Whole swans sewn back into their own feathers. Gold leaf on the meat. The verdict is always the same. Greed, vanity, men who could not control themselves. But look at what is on that table, and something is off. Almost none of it keeps. A king with a treasury problem is buying the one category of goods that cannot be stored, cannot be resold, and is worthless by Thursday. That is not appetite. That is a decision. Look at the rest of the list and the pattern holds. The wine has crossed an ocean of coastline to get here, and it will be gone in 4 days. The spices cost more by weight than the silver plate they are sprinkled from, and they are being sprinkled. The meat has been walked in on the hoof from 3 counties and slaughtered on site, because there is no way to keep it otherwise. Every single line on that inventory is an asset that self-destructs. And in a great many cases, the man paying for it has borrowed the money. That is the part that should stop you, not the excess. The financing. Because a person who is short of cash and buys something that lasts has made a bad decision. A person who is short of cash and borrows to buy something that will be eaten by the end of the week has either lost his mind or is buying something other than the food. He is buying something other than the food. This is the piece that the word feast hides. In the great halls of Western Europe, roughly between the 12th century and the 15th, the banquet was not primarily a meal, and it was not primarily a celebration. It was a machine that did work no other instrument available at the time could do. It was a payment system. It was a courtroom. It was a credit rating, published in the only format a creditor could actually verify. And it was a public register of who ranked above whom, enacted in front of the only witnesses who counted. None of that was decoration on top of dinner. That was the function. Dinner was the medium. The reason comes down to one physical fact about medieval wealth. And once you have it, the rest of the period reorganizes itself around it. A king's income did not arrive as money. It arrived as things. Sheaves of grain, cheeses, hens, cartloads of hay, barrels of ale, and days of labor owed by people who lived on land he had never visited. It sat in barns across dozens of counties. It rotted on a schedule. It could not be moved far, it could not be counted in one place, and it could not be shown to anyone. Which leaves one method. Gather it into a single room and destroy it in front of the people whose obedience you need. It had to be spent to be seen. Hold on to that sentence, because it is going to explain a lot of things that currently look like personality. And here is the promise of the next half hour. Once you can see the constraint underneath, medieval extravagance stops sounding like a description of what those people were like, and starts sounding like the consequence of a problem they could not solve any other way. One caution before we go further. Medieval Europe is 1,000 years and a continent, and almost any sentence beginning the medieval world is wrong, somewhere. So everything here comes with a place and a century attached. The evidence runs mainly through England, the wine ports of Gascony, and the Burgundian court in the later part of the period. Where historians disagree, I will say so. Start with the problem in your hands, rather than in the abstract. You have inherited a crown in northern France or southern England in the 13th century. On parchment, you are rich. Your income comes from several hundred manors. Now try to do something with it. The first thing you discover is that almost none of it is money. A manor owes you a fixed render. So many quarters of wheat, so many geese at Michaelmas, so many days of plowing in spring. The wheat is in a barn 100 miles away. Moving it to you overland is barely worth doing, because the oxen pulling the cart eat as they walk, and past a certain distance the cargo has consumed itself. The geese are alive, and will need feeding on the road. The plowing days cannot be transported at all. Walk into one of those barns in October, and you will understand the difficulty better than any ledger explains it. It is dark, it smells of dust and mice, and it is full. Full of your income. Wheat in the sheaf, stacked to the beams. It is genuinely yours, and it is also a wasting asset with a clock on it, guarded by a reeve you have never met, in a village whose name you would have to look up. Some of it will be eaten by the people who grew it. Some of it will spoil. Some will be sold at the local market for whatever the local market can pay, which in a bad year is very little, because everyone nearby has the same surplus at the same moment and nobody within reach has cash. Multiply that barn by several hundred and you have the royal balance sheet. Enormous, real, and almost entirely stuck. The second thing you discover is that coin is genuinely scarce, and much of what circulates is clipped, worn, or foreign. There is no bank you can deposit in. There is no ledger that a stranger will accept as proof of anything. And the third thing, which is the real problem, is this. You cannot show it to anybody. There is no document you can hand a rival lord that proves you can field an army next spring. There is no statement you can send to a merchant in Lucca that proves you will still be solvent when his loan falls due. The idea of an audited account that an outsider can inspect and trust does not exist yet. Your wealth is real, and it is invisible. And invisible wealth buys you exactly nothing, in a world where every relationship you have runs on other people's estimate of your strength. So you convert. You take the invisible thing, and you turn it into an event. Consider one item on the table. In London in the late 1430s, a pound of saffron cost a master mason the better part of a month. Not a month of saving, a month of work. Roughly 23 days on the scaffolding, in the cold, hands cracked with lime, and at the end of it, he could carry home a single pound of dried orange threads. Almost none of that pound is doing anything to the taste. Saffron's main job on a high table was color. It turned food gold. So what is actually being served, when the dish comes out glowing, is a month of a skilled man's working life, ground into powder, spread across a platter, and eaten before it can be reconsidered. Everyone in the hall understands the conversion rate. That is what makes it work. Now the name for all of this. What we are looking at is an economy that has not been monetized, held together by people who have no mechanism for verifying each other. Modern economies solve that with paper. Contracts, accounts, ratings, registries. Medieval Europe had almost none of that infrastructure, and where it existed, it was thin and local. So, verification had to happen the old way. In a room, in a body, in public, with witnesses. The feast was the verification technology. It was expensive for the same reason a lock is heavy. The cost was the point. Anything cheap enough to fake would have proved nothing. Once you accept that the wealth cannot move and cannot be shown, a series of consequences follow that had nothing to do with anyone's character. The first is that the court itself becomes mobile. If you cannot bring the grain to the king, you bring the king to the grain. Across England, France, and the German lands, royal and noble households spent much of the year on the road, moving from estate to estate, consuming each manor's render where it sat, and then moving on before the local surplus ran out. The itinerant household is usually described as a quirk of medieval kingship. It is not a quirk, it is a haulage solution. The king travels because his income cannot. That also means the great hall of a country manor was not built for a family. It was built for the 2 or 3 weeks a year when 150 people, their horses and their servants, arrived and had to be fed, seated, ranked, and impressed. Most of the year it stood mostly empty. It was infrastructure for an event. The second consequence is uglier, and it is where this stops being wry. A traveling household of that size eats faster than the countryside around it can restock. So the English crown, like others, held a prerogative called purveyance, the right of the king's officers to requisition food, carts, horses, and fuel from the people they passed at a price the crown assessed, rather than the price the market would have paid, with settlement in a written tally to be honored later. In practice, that meant men arriving in a village with authority and taking what the hall needed. The compensation was set by the buyer. The payment was deferred. And enforcement, if you were a farmer with a tally and no payment, ran through the same crown that owed you. This was not a minor irritation. Purveyance was one of the most consistently hated exercises of royal power in medieval England. Magna Carta addressed it directly in 1215, requiring that goods taken be paid for. It kept being addressed, which tells you it kept happening. In 1362, a statute finally confined it to the personal needs of the king and queen, ended it for military supply, and reclassified the officers as purchasers required to pay. Governments do not keep legislating against a practice that has stopped. So before we go any further, the display was funded, in part, by an involuntary transfer from the people least able to absorb it, and it is worth saying that plainly rather than folding it into a list of colorful medieval customs. The third consequence is the import bill. Some of what the table required could not be produced domestically at all, and the largest single item was wine. England drank Gascon wine, and the trade was not boutique. Picture the mouth of the Gironde in a good autumn. An estuary so crowded with hulls waiting on the tide that the season's shipping was tallied the way a harvest is tallied, and the tally was the news that mattered in Bordeaux that year. In the record season at the start of the 14th century, more than 100,000 tons went out through it. A ton is a barrel a grown man cannot get his arms around. A substantial share of every year's sailing crossed to England, and the English crown taxed it coming in and drank a good deal of the rest. That was not a luxury sideline. It was one of the largest bulk trades in Northern Europe. It was taxed at the port, And it existed because the top of society had to be able to put a foreign, dated, expensive liquid in front of guests on demand. Once a society decides that a room full of witnesses is its verification system, it starts building institutions around the room. Begin with the furniture. On the high table of a late medieval English or French hall stood a large ceremonial salt cellar, often the most valuable object in sight. Its position was not casual. Guests were seated above the salt or below it, and everybody in the hall could see which side of it you were on. Think about what that object is doing. There is no register of precedence a merchant can look up. There is no public record of who outranks whom that anyone can consult. So rank is established the only way it can be, physically, in front of the entire household, at dinner, repeatedly, until it is a fact everyone has personally witnessed. The seating plan is the Constitution. The meal is the ceremony that ratifies it. And if your place moves down the table this year, 300 people learn it in the same instant, without a word being said. That is not etiquette. That is a legal system with no paperwork. The signal did get counterfeited, and the response to that tells you what it was worth. After the plague years of the mid-14th century, the population of England collapsed and wages rose sharply. Ordinary people suddenly had money, and some of them began eating and dressing like their betters. The response was legislation. Edward III had already tried, in 1336, to hold everyone, regardless of rank, to 2 courses of 2 dishes. In 1363, Parliament passed a statute governing diet and apparel, laying out in detail which ranks could wear which cloth and eat at which standard, with the finest reserved for the top. Ask why a government under war finance pressure would spend its time regulating dinner. The answer is that if the table is your rank registry, then people eating above their station is not a matter of taste. It is forgery. The state is defending the integrity of its own signaling system, in the same spirit as a mint defending a coinage. And these laws did not work particularly well, which is its own piece of evidence. The signal was too useful to too many people to be policed. The third institution is credit, and it is where the borrowing starts to make sense. A merchant house in Florence or Lucca, weighing a loan to a northern prince, had no audited accounts to read, no way to enforce a judgment against him, and no market price on his debt. What it had was a hall. You could attend. You could see who else attended, how they were seated, and whether the great men of the realm had come when summoned. You could see what was served and estimate what it cost. In a world with no instruments, a feast was the closest thing to a public disclosure. That is the shape of a credit rating, assembled from the only materials on hand. The comparison has limits, and they matter. The fourth institution is diplomacy. And for that we go to Lille. In February of 1454, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, held a banquet in the wake of the fall of Constantinople the year before. Between the courses came staged interludes, including the church appearing in mourning to lament what had been lost. Then a live pheasant was carried to the ducal table, and Philip laid his hand on the bird and swore to go on crusade. His nobles rose and swore after him. No crusade sailed, not one ship. And yet the evening did most of what it was built to do. It announced that Burgundy, formerly a vassal of the French crown, could convene the chivalry of Europe and speak in the register of a sovereign power. That claim did not need a fleet. It needed an audience. And the audience was in the room. One more case, because it comes with a warning attached. The most quoted medieval feast in the English language is the enthronement of George Neville as Archbishop of York in 1465. And the quantities attached to it are staggering. Barrels of ale and wine by the 100, sheep and oxen in the thousands. And yes, the woodcock, along with seals and porpoises. Those figures need handling. The list everyone quotes was printed in the 1640s, nearly 2 centuries after the event, by a lawyer who published it to expose what he called the pride and vainglory of that prelate. Historians were already skeptical of it 200 years ago, and the doubt has not gone away, so I will not lean on it as evidence. But notice what the document does prove, which is better than what it claims. By the 17th century, publishing a churchman's grocery list was understood to be an effective political attack. That only works if everyone already agrees the table was a statement about power. The pamphlet is unreliable about the sheep, and entirely reliable about the steaks. In this system, prestige could not be banked. Think about what an ordinary asset does. You buy it, and it sits there. A wall built in one generation is still standing in the next. Land bought this year yields next year. Even a reputation, in a world of written records, accumulates. But a signal that has to be consumed in front of witnesses has no such property. It depreciates from the moment the hall empties. Last year's feast proves nothing about this year's solvency, because the entire point of the mechanism was that anyone could have staged one occasion by liquidating everything they owned, which means there is no such thing as a reserve of standing. There is only the current spend. Follow the logic to its conclusion, because it is genuinely brutal. A prince in 15th century England or France who reduced his household spending in a difficult year had not made a prudent adjustment. He had published a statement, in the only medium that his creditors, his rivals, and his own retainers could read, that he could no longer afford what he used to afford. Retainers who serve for advancement start listening to other offers. Lenders reprice. Rivals reconsider their timetable. So the frugal, solvent, cautious ruler was not a road less traveled. He was structurally close to impossible. The one moment when cutting the spend made accounting sense was the exact moment when cutting it was most dangerous. That is not a failure of self-discipline. That is a trap with no exit, which is where the borrowing comes in. Through the 1330s and 40s, Edward III of England financed his war in France with enormous loans from Florentine banking houses, chiefly the Bardi and the Peruzzi, the largest lenders in Europe. When the quick victory did not come, he stopped paying. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani put the loss at 900,000 florins for the Bardi alone, with the Peruzzi not far behind. Both houses failed in the following years. I want to be careful here, on two fronts. First, that money went to armies, not to swans. It would be dishonest to tell you the banks of Florence were destroyed by a dinner, but war finance and display finance were not separate accounts. They were the same credit line, extended on the same collateral, and that collateral was the perceived standing of the borrower, which was maintained by exactly the machinery we have been describing. Second, the numbers are contested. Villani was himself a partner in one of the failed houses, which is not a neutral position. Later scholarship has argued the firm simply did not hold enough capital to have lent on the scale the traditional story requires, and that the collapse had deeper causes than one royal default. What survives the argument is the thing that matters more. The houses did fail, and the reason a sovereign was such dangerous business had nothing to do with the size of any particular loan. It was that you could not sue him. There was no court above a king, no bankruptcy process, no collateral you could seize. His willingness to pay was the security, and willingness cannot be foreclosed on. That is the idea that never got built. Not cheap credit, not sound public finance, not a funded national debt. All of it kept dying at the same wall. And the wall was that the strongest party to the contract was the only one who could not be compelled to honor it. So take the charge sheet from the beginning and read it again. Gluttony. The perishability was never a side effect that a wiser man would have avoided. It was the mechanism. An asset that survives the evening can be borrowed against, hidden, or exaggerated. An asset consumed in front of 300 people has been verified by 300 people and cannot be unconsumed. The waste was the proof. Something that could be recovered afterwards would have proved nothing at all. Vanity. Yes, it was about being seen, because being seen was the only channel that existed. A man whose wealth sits invisible in barns across 6 counties has exactly one way to make it real to anyone else, and it runs through their eyes. Strip away the peacocks, and what is left is a disclosure requirement being met in the only available format. We have a word for the same behavior today, and it is not vanity. It is publishing your accounts, recklessness. The spending looks most irrational precisely when the treasury was emptiest, and that is exactly backwards from how it worked. When money was tight, the signal mattered more, not less, because that was when everyone around you was quietly recalculating. A lord who tightened his household in a lean year was not saving himself. He was telling every retainer, creditor, and rival simultaneously that the lean year was real. Spending into weakness is not a loss of control. It is the only move left on the board. And the men who made it knew the odds better than we do. And the last one, the quiet one, that they simply did not understand money. They understood what money could not yet do. There was no instrument that let a stranger check whether you were good for it. So they built one out of wine, meat, seating, and spice. And they ran it for centuries. And it worked well enough that lenders on the other side of Europe committed fortunes on the strength of it. It had to be spent to be seen. But hear it differently now. What was being bought was never the meal, and never really the admiration. It was the willingness of other people to act as though you were strong, to serve, to lend, to obey, to wait another year before testing you. That belief was the only asset in the medieval political economy that could be spent and still be there in the morning. One correction before we move on, because it matters. None of this means the arithmetic decided everything. It did not. Constraints do not choose. They set the boundaries of what can be chosen. Two rulers under identical pressure could be generous or cruel, careful or ruinous. And the difference between them was theirs. What the constraint determined was the shape of the room they had to choose inside. Within that room, they were people, and they were responsible for what they did. Which raises the obvious question. If the system was this expensive, why did it end? Not because anyone became more sensible. The record is clear that nobody involved developed a taste for modesty. Three things changed underneath, and each of them was a number rather than a virtue. The first was paper that outsiders could trust. As permanent taxation replaced occasional emergency grants, and as royal accounting grew into something continuous and inspectable, a ruler's finances slowly became a thing that could be written down, argued about, and lent against on the strength of the document. Once a creditor could examine a revenue stream on parchment, he no longer needed to examine a banquet. The hall had been performing an audit function, and the audit function was quietly taken over by clerks. The second was durable display. Consider what it means to build a great palace, or commission a portrait, or endow a chapel with your name carved into it. You pay once, and it signals for the rest of your life, and well past it. Compare that to buying the same amount of standing and perishable goods, one evening at a time, forever. As soon as the durable option became affordable and secure enough to be worth it, the arithmetic tipped hard, and the money moved from the table to the wall. It was never a change of taste. It was a change in the price of permanence. The third was the shrinking of the audience, and there is a striking piece of evidence for it from inside the period. In 14th century England, a poet complained bitterly that the great hall now stood dismal and empty at mealtimes, because the lord and lady no longer cared to sit there. They had taken to eating apart, in a private chamber. He wrote that as a lament for a world going wrong. Read it as a market signal instead. Universal display, to the whole household, every single day, is what you pay for when you need everyone's belief. The moment the people who actually matter to your position narrow to a smaller and more specific set, paying to impress the entire hall becomes waste in a way it simply was not before. So the lord withdraws, and the display goes with him, and it gets more expensive per head and much smaller in number. That is the same instinct running through all three. The signal did not disappear. It relocated into rooms with fewer people, into objects that do not spoil, into documents that a stranger can verify without leaving his counting house. Nobody got humbler. Verification just got cheaper. There is a familiar shape here, and it is worth naming carefully, because naming a shape is useful and claiming an equivalence is not. The shape is this. When the true state of something cannot be checked directly, people fall back on judging it by what it evidently cost. That is why an organization will hold a lease on premises far grander than its work requires, and why the expense is not simply irrational. Anyone can claim to be stable. Not everyone can be seen sustaining an obvious burden, month after month, without visible strain. The visible burden is doing the work that a document would do, if the document existed or if anyone trusted it. It is a strange kind of expenditure, because its value comes entirely from the fact that it cannot be faked cheaply. The moment a signal becomes affordable to everyone who wants to send it, it stops carrying information and becomes decoration, and whoever is relying on it has to find something more expensive to do instead. That escalation is the same in any century. Now the part that keeps this honest, which is where the comparison breaks. It breaks in two places, and both are serious. The first is that a modern firm's accounts exist. They are prepared, audited, filed, and a competitor can read them. The signal sits on top of a verification system. In 14th century Europe, the signal was the verification system, with nothing underneath it, which is a completely different situation and produces completely different behavior. The second break is sharper. A modern organization can cut its visible spending in a bad year, absorb the embarrassment, and survive on its books. The books are still there. A late medieval magnate had no books to fall back on. If he cut, there was nothing else for anyone to look at, and the cut itself became the only new information in circulation. That is the real distance between then and now. Not that they were more foolish about display, that we have somewhere else to look, and they did not. So the swans were not the extravagance. They were the settlement of a bill that came due whether anyone liked it or not, in a world that had no other way of proving that a man was what he said he was. Strip out the gold leaf and the peacocks and the staged interludes, and what remains is a serious problem being solved, with the only materials on hand. How do you make an invisible thing visible to people who have every reason to doubt you and no way to check? That does not make any of it innocent. It was paid for, in part, by villages that had no say in it, and no realistic way to collect what they were owed, and that cost belongs in the account alongside everything else. Both things are true at once. The constraint was real, and so was the harm, and the men inside it were making choices the whole time. But the next time one of those provisioning lists turns up as proof that the Middle Ages were a stupid, gluttonous age, look at what is actually on the page. Every item spoils. Every item was bought in public, and a great deal of it was bought with borrowed money by men who could not afford to look like men who could not afford it. The extravagance was never the swans. The extravagance was living in a world where that was the cheapest way left to be believed. That is the price of proving you have something. Next time, a harder problem. The price of being obeyed by people you will never meet, in places you will never reach. Across a distance no order could travel faster than a horse.